The continent of Tamriel is home to a variety of different magical disciplines. The School of Restoration, to heal and support yourself and your allies. The Thuum, the Storm Voice, which is how dragons talk. These are cool and all, but there's one school of magic that seems to always be under attack for some reason. Of course, I'm talking about the sublime and blessed art of necromancy. So, what is necromancy? How does it work? Why is Mannimarco so handsome? It's time to answer all these questions and more. So what is necromancy? That's actually quite simple. No need for any huge digressions here, at least not yet. Necromancy is the magical study of the soul, but obviously it can't be that simple. To really understand what necromancy is, we should start by explaining in greater detail the school of magic closest to necromancy. Gameplay mechanic-wise, you might be tricked into thinking that conjuration was closest to necromancy. In fact, there's little to no similarity there. Lore-wise, the closest school of magic to necromancy is mysticism. Sky babies, or should I say sky boomers at this point, wouldn't know, but mysticism used to be a learnable school of magic in the games. In Oblivion, it contains Soul Trap, Spell Absorption, Dispel, Detect Life, Telekinesis, and Reflection spells. In Morrowind, it had all that, and also you could absorb attributes and stats, detect more than life, and this is also where you got your teleportation spells. Daggerfall is where it gets interesting. Here you get most everything before, plus silence, banish, lock, and open, and the ability to comprehend languages. I should note that in the Elder Scrolls, it's stated in-universe that the categorization of magic is pedological. The schools of magic are just a teaching aid. In addition, the categories are really based on effects. Destruction spells are called that because they're damaging and flashy and destroy. Alteration changes physical attributes. Mysticism, though, seems a bit scattershot. In terms of effects, it's treated as the type of magic that deals in the direct manipulation of magic as such. This makes sense in some ways. Souls are magic, so Soul Trap makes sense, and obviously, necromancy is related to Soul Trap, so I could call it there. But I'm not going to. We're going to talk about the sorcery behind the effects, because it's not just way more interesting, it's more helpful in understanding what's going on with necromancy. This is from Mysticism, the Unfathomable Voyage. There are few mages who devote their lives to the study of mysticism. The other schools are far more predictable and ascertainable. Mysticism seems to derive power from its conundrums and paradoxes. The act of experimentation, no matter how objectively implemented, can influence magicka by its very existence. Therefore, the mystic mage must consign himself to finding dependable patterns within a roiling imbroglio of energy. In the time it takes him to devise an enchantment with a consistent trigger and result, his peers in the other schools may have researched and documented dozens of new spells and effects. The mystic mage must thus be a patient and relatively uncompetitive philosopher. And this is dialogue from an Argonian mage named Re-Zish from ESO. Mysticism responds strongly to sympathetic acts. Their spell here wards the cave. Symbolically, it's the same energy hauled from the dead. And my final citation here is from the Black Arts on Trial, in which the esteemed Master Gakog states, "The school of mysticism by its very nature forces the practitioner to divorce his mind from logic, to embrace a temporary sort of insanity, which one might argue is very like corrupting one's soul." So honestly, this is more or less all we have in regards to mysticism, speaking directly about it. But I think this, in conjunction with the name, paints a clear picture. You see, this school of magic is called mysticism. Like the school of alchemy, mysticism is just straight up a real thing. The word itself refers to lots of generally different ideas, but I'd say the underlying base for all of them is that mystics are talking about complicated topics in a metaphor-laden way that is difficult to understand for outsiders. So, for example, let's take Hegel. Hegel is a well-known philosopher who happens to have been an obvious influence on Elder Scrolls lore, and he was definitely a mystic. The things that made him a mystic were not just talking about complicated subjects like ontology and theology, but he did so in a way that is basically incomprehensible even in German. So, why does anybody write, or God forbid, speak like this? There are three main reasons, though of course there are sub-reasons and combinations, but we'll just stick to three. The first is to be deliberately obtuse. This is more common than you'd think. You hide your information behind so many layers of jargon and metaphor that only people in the field know what you're talking about. This is very popular in both occult and philosophical circles. The second is that you really are trying to be descriptive. Metaphor is like a human compression file. If I say, that woman is smoking hot, everyone knows a woman is not on fire or expelling smoke. Rather, they know more information than if I had tried to explicate all the ways in which that hypothetical woman is physically attractive in a logical fashion. The final reason is that you're talking about something that's ineffable. If you don't know that word, it means to be too great to be expressed in words. Sometimes sentimental types might say that the true beauty of a sunset is ineffable, but more philosophical types will instead relegate the term to things like God or the true nature of the soul. It's here that we get our philosophical mystics and occultists. Read enough stuff like it and you start to understand it, which can come in handy with understanding video games sometimes. So why become insane? Because you're talking about things that are fundamentally ineffable. All mystics are like this, and this follows us into the Elder Scrolls school of mysticism. And here I'm going to give an example from Elder Scrolls that was certainly not meant to be an example, but nevertheless illustrates my point. I noted that in Daggerfall, spells to unlock and lock were in the school of mysticism. After Daggerfall, they were moved to alteration. I like to think, in-universe, this is because there are two methods to manipulate a lock. The alteration way is obvious and easy to explain. A lock has tumblers and pins and mechanical pieces in it that you can simply physically move in the right way to unlock or lock the mechanism. But for a mystic, there's another way. The abstract concept of lock is in essence an object with two states, open and closed. Instead of fiddling with physical pins, the mysticism spell changes the state of the particular representation of the holistic concept of the lock in itself. You could think of it, somewhat inaccurately, as the lock having a very simple soul with only two settings. Manipulate that soul directly and change the setting, and the physical object follows. So what about, say, stealing attributes? That's also easy. Think of it as splicing information from somebody's soul onto your own. What about teleportation? Think of it as your holistic being having a coordinate system inside of it, as we can represent ourselves as empty save our relations to other things. Change the coordinates, change your position. This could even explain why the teleportation spells we had access to in games are just mark and recall. Safer to copy and paste known coordinates than risk scattering our essence across the ocean or something. So with all this in mind, we can move to Necromancy. Necromancy, as I said when I started this, is the magical study of the soul. Obviously, the most noticeable part of the soul is if it's alive or dead, and there's obviously great utility in the idea of bringing somebody back to life. There's just a few problems with that. I talked about the Dream Sleeve in my previous Hist video, so I won't be retreading old information about it here. I suggest going back and watching that video if you find yourself confused. However, I will have to tread new information. While in the Hist video I focused on dreams, this time I'll be focusing on death. First, the most basic of necromantic arts is reanimation. What does it mean to reanimate? Unhallowed Legion says on the subject, these monstrosities are formed when a necromancer summons and instills an enslaved spirit, often a minor daedric essence, into a corpse or construct of bodies. Reanimations take many shapes, from the lowly skeleton, favorite of novice necromancers, to the hulking flesh Atronach. So, reanimation isn't too picky about what kind of soul is needed to reanimate a body. Since daedric essence can be used, let's talk about daedric souls. This is from Chaotic Creatia, the azure plasm. It has long been understood that a daedra who lacks the anuic animus known as the soul is not killed when its body is destroyed. A daedra slain upon Mundus is merely banished back to its plane of origin, where its morphotype, or vestige, gradually forms a new body, so that eventually the daedra lives again. This is actually a bit oversimplified. A slain daedra's soul returns to the waters of oblivion before it reforms a new body in its plane of origin. There's a bunch of dialogue about this, especially in Oblivion's Shivering Isles DLC, so I'll pick Delora, a dark seducer.
The Wellspring is a sinecure, a place where the animus of lost Mazkin can return to this realm from the waters of oblivion. The darkness is a frightening place, even to us, and so our Lord has given us this beacon, a light to guide us back to him.
So let's take a look at Molag Bal. This may seem out of left field, but he does at least two contrasting things with mortal souls. create soul-shriven, and create vampires. Vampires first. This is from Dulef in a Lore Master's archive. The mortals we call vampires are people who are infused with Daedric energy of a very specific type. Purebloods get it straight from the prince himself. Some steal the power from another. But most, we could say, are afflicted with a type of disease that acts as a bridge or proxy into the mortal's soul. The result, regardless of the origin point, is a vampire of one stripe or another. And here's one line from Rite of the Scion, a rite that vampires do to be accepted by the Blood Matron. Molag Bal, father of torment, we curse you. You sought to poison us with your blood. If you're thinking about things in a literalistic, anatomy-obsessed human way, you might think this has something to do with flesh. But no, Molag Bal doesn't have that kind of blood. This is talking about the quality of soul. As Dragonborn have the blood of a dragon, vampires have the blood of Molag Bal. On to soul-shriven, which are simpler. Basically, Molag Bal has taken a mortal's Aedric soul and replaced it with the Daedric vestige. Again, from Chaotic Creatia, the Azure Plasm. Then there are the poor slaves known as the soul-shriven. Each is a mortal kidnapped from Mundus at the moment of death, his or her soul stolen by Molag Bal for some unthinkable purpose, and given in exchange the vestige that enables him or her to form a counterfeit body here in Cold Harbor. But they are not natives to Oblivion, so a soul-shriven's body is a sad imitation of the body worn in life, suffering rapid wear and decay until it dies. A death that is no liberation, for its vestige only forms a body once again, over and over, ad infinitum. There's an interesting character in ESO's Cold Harbor, a Nord woman who has no soul but isn't a horrible husk creature. She lives inside a tavern, as is typical of Nords. When asked about this, she says, "Yes, we stay inside and drink. We have no souls. We were afraid to die in this godforsaken place. Nords without souls aren't welcome to Sovngarde, you know." So, for an explanation of necromancy, we only need to know that all mortals have two things, the soul and the body. When a body dies, the soul goes to the dream sleeve. When a body sleeps, it also goes to the dream sleeve. The dream sleeve is the conduit for soul transfer to someplace else. So using these details, we can describe any mortal using three status variables. These variables are alive or dead, asleep or awake, and on Mundus or in the dream sleeve. A normal living person is alive, awake on Mundus. A normal sleeping person is alive, sleeping in the dream sleeve. A dead person is dead, asleep in the dream sleeve. A reanimated corpse is dead, awake on Mundus. So what is a necromancer actually doing when he reanimates a corpse? This is from On Necromancy. Have you ever wondered why there are so many skeletons among the reanimated undead, fewer zombies, and only a scant few revenants? The longer a body remains inanimate, the less hold its original owner has on the corpse. A spirit can stay tied to its remains for days, weeks, or even years. The shorter the time, the more likely the spiritual umbilicus exists. A wise necromancer does not wish to fight for control of his creation with an angry spirit seeking a way back into the world. Best to be certain all of a creature's soul has departed before reanimation begins. Even should the necromancer win the battle, it is a cruel victory, tormenting a spirit on its way to rest. Raising the dead so recent that the soul is not yet fled is ill-advised, as true resurrection is not the purview of the necromancer, but something best left to gods and priests. And here's a shorter excerpt from Practical Necromancy. Write the name of the spirits you wish to summon on the piece of animal hide. Be sure you have no injuries that might spill blood on the circle. Trapping one's own soul in a summoning circle is rarely fatal, but is sure to provoke the mockery of your peers. So, the dream sleeve handles both dying and sleeping souls. Sleeping is a bit like death, which means dying is a bit like sleeping. If that's the case, then to summon a soul, you simply need to wake one up. Once it's awake, you bind it to something, perhaps an object or location to keep it as a shade, or to a body to create a minion. The souls of the recently deceased haven't been recycled yet, and so still have enough connection to their old self to be violent and angry at you for messing with their transfer. But old souls probably don't have memories, let alone this connection. They're free unmantled souls, which then fill the matter of the corpse you've made. This is not true resurrection, as was noted. Necromancy isn't precise enough. An unmantled soul doesn't carry a mimic, nor is there enough appropriate external energies to form a body even if it did, And we don't even know if the process Daedra and Lucky Mortals go through are properties of the souls themselves, or of the realms they appear in, or some combination. The point is, a necromancer is basically shoving any old soul into a bag of bones, and this is somewhat similar to an inverse of how birth works as described by Mankar Cameron. The soul is mantling the corpse, creating something akin to the living thing it used to be. This is the most basic of necromantic acts, but it's not the only thing necromancers can do. Vampires and liches are also undead, so let's focus on the latter now. Recall how souls came to be on Nirn in the first place. For Myr, they were the Aedra, and their mortal degradation turned their golden souls into something lesser than it once was. For men, they were created, but were given a path to reach something higher than what they were made as. But all mortals die. They die for a variety of metaphysical reasons, such as the flesh being destructible and the soul being weak in comparison to various magical beings. So what if, now hear me out, what if you can improve upon the mortal soul? Have you ever read The Path to Transcendence? It describes in vague terms how liches are made. Yes, a necromancer must transfer his soul into a physical vessel, but once that transference is complete, once the necromancer has fully metamorphosed into his lich form, the vessel is inconsequential. Unhallowed Legions offers a bit more on what is happening here. The lich, for one, is a corpse that is self-reanimated by the soul it bore in life. And we have Vistari, who gives us the most detailed explanation we have, as far as I know, about what exactly is going on. Lichdom is a state of being, the most sophisticated form of undeath. While lesser necromancers busy themselves with other people's souls, liches turn inward, manipulating their own soul to gain power and extend their life. To become a lich, the necromancer must press their soul through an arcane vessel called a phylactery. This requires a lifetime of study, mind you, and fierce power of will. Souls contain tremendous power, but they place certain checks on mortal will. Divesting the two, soul and mortal form, removes these boundaries. The effect is virtually limitless magical horizon. The process extracts a heavy toll, of course. Traveling through the phylactery can tear a lich's psyche apart, resulting in madness. Long separation from one's soul can lead to apathy and megalomania as well. In almost all cases, lichdom becomes a curse in very short order. So, seems pretty clear all things considered. Liches are attempting to remove mortal limits on their own souls, using rituals and objects. One of the biggest benefits is a kind of immortality. But also, Vistari mentions will, which is interesting. Out of universe, willpower used to be an attribute, back when Elder Scrolls games were RPGs. The attribute governed almost all schools of magic, determined how much fatigue you had, and how fast your magicka regenerated, and determined spell resistance, depending on which game we're talking about. In-universe, there are also mind-shriven, which have lost their willpower. These benefits are in contrast to the drawbacks. The biggest one is that you died. You're going to look like a corpse. The second is that in dying, your soul didn't go through the proper process of going to the Dream Sleeve or the Waters of Oblivion or wherever, and instead went to the lich's phylactery. Once the process of soul and body separation is complete, the phylactery is no longer necessary. Phylacteries are themselves magically prepared, so it's probable that this accounts for the differences in lich appearances and abilities we see. Different spells result in different modifications to the soul. Ultimately, they're following the process of death. The soul leaves, is modified, then comes back. Because we're following stages of death, you're losing parts of your psyche in an unnatural death state. Liches are trying to increase benefits while decreasing drawbacks, but we only know of one who's managed only benefits with no drawbacks. That would be Blessed Mannimarco, God of Worms. But before we get to him, it's time to talk about Dragonbreaks. I think we all know what Dragonbreaks are. A common opinion about them is that they're just an excuse for lazy writing. I have a different opinion. There's no arguing that Dragonbreaks were created to solve the problem of Daggerfall's multiple endings. And if all Dragonbreaks were invoked for was to solve plot issues, I might agree with that sentiment. But in point of fact, Dragonbreaks came with an entire follow-through that wouldn't have been necessary if all they were was a plot contrivance. In fact, if that's all they were unnecessary anyway. Morrowind takes place on the opposite side of Tambriel as Daggerfall did. It had been easy to just say news about what happened hadn't reached Morrowind yet, and figure out what to say about it later. So yes, the warp in the west gives us a neat excuse for how all of Daggerfall's endings happened. But there were more Dragonbreaks than just the warp in the west, and their mechanics and implications were followed through. Far from making writing lazy, it gives us a fascinating perspective on several important events through history. Dragonbreaks are periods of time in which time is non-linear. That means non-linear, not acausal. Now, we know the warp in the west. We also know the Middle Dawn. I would add the Battle of Red Mountain to this list, and I have evidence for that. But are there any other stated Dragonbreaks? Why yes, there's at least one more. The actual Dawn. Linear time was set at convention. Before that, it wasn't linear. There's a few others I'd say are obvious. Tiber Septim's activation of the Numidium at Rimmen. The Battle of Red Mountain. Landfall, if you think that's where this is all going. There's something about all these Dragonbreaks I find obvious, but which I haven't seen any Elder Scrolls lorist explicitly claim. That is, all these times are the same time. Look at this, from the Secret Songs of Wulfharth Ash King, The Armies Grow. I'm not even going to make fun of it, it's so important and cool. And the Ash King Wulfharth, hoary Ysmir, went and made peace with the orcs in spite of his Nordic blood, and they brought many warriors but no wizards at all. Many Nords could not bring themselves to ally with their traditional enemies, even in the face of Red Mountain. They were close to desertion. Then Wulfharth said, "Don't you see where you really are? Don't you know who Shor really is? Don't you know what this war is?" And they looked from the king to the god to the devils and orcs, and some knew, really knew, and they are the ones that stayed. Don't you understand what the Battle of Red Mountain really was? Don't you see when it happened? Who was Wulfharth, that hoary Ysmir? He was the Underking. And who was the Underking? Zurin Arctis. Who was Zurin Arctis? Talos Stormcrown, also known as Tiber Septim. This is all very simple, unironically. This is the easy part. Wulfharth, leader of the Nords, fought at the Battle of Red Mountain for Shor's heart, as Shor, son of Shor and leader of men, fought Ariel in Altmora when it was still Old El Nofe. At the same time the Brass God was at Red Mountain, it was also at Rimmen, and also in the Iliac Bay region, and also sieging Alinor. The prophet Maruk danced on the tower, while the Eight decided what to do with Lorkhan, and his heart was shot into the sea. As the Eight left, 8 stars fell on Tamriel. And what is the number 8? The scripture of the numbers tell us 8 is both the number of the wheel and of the divines. Is this also hard to believe? How are you supposed to say that this instance of nonlinear time is separate from that one? Because they happened at different places on the timeline? What timeline? That timeline only exists when time is linear. Need more proof? The Augur of the Obscure says, if Anumaril created the Staff of Towers in the First Era, how'd he know about a tower the dwarves hadn't made yet? Nuhata in the Numantia Intercept says, every Dawnmaker tower takes a myth form. Red Tower is a volcano and its surrounds. Snowthroat, a mountain whose apex is only half there. Walkbrass is appropriately ambulatory and most of the time anthropomorphic. How is Walkbrass a Dawnmaker if it was made in the First Era? What about on the detachment of the sheath from the integument? This is explicitly about Dragonbreaks and how the Middle Dawn was made. Though all given concavities or sheaths within the integuments of the Arbus are necessarily contained by the Arbus, right-reaching dictates that a defined sheath may be detached from the integument by invocation of Nemoli. Upon intercourse with the Star Orphan, the beseeching Elastic performs a version of the organ of thought, an employment of the hurling disc that recapitulates the truth that a circle turned sideways is a tower. By same truth, twisting the enveloping sheath into the Middle Dawn to the number of 17, brings it to untime and unplace. Eventualism, of course, predicts reabsorption upon depletion of the wheeling force, but the absence of duration may render even eventuality moot. This is ESO lore, by the way. This kind of stuff is why I say Kirkbride lore is unavoidable. Anyway, the important part for my argument is the last 2 lines, but for completion's sake, let me translate this entire thing into normal English. The dragon is a sheath encasing Nirn, and the concavity is the curvature underneath the dragon. Integument means organ, and Nirn is the organ sitting inside the dragon. Creating something new dictates that you can break the dragon through use of memory and interaction with the Star Orphan. You then turn your mind inside out in order to understand the true name of God. With this understanding, you twist the dragon such that it is in the shape of the Arbis as a whole, which brings Nirn into untime and unplace. Eventually, this will revert, but since this is happening in untime, there is no eventually within that unplace. Makes sense, right? Have you ever read Where Were You When the Dragon Broke and noticed the names mentioned as being there? This is supposed to be about the Middle Dawn, but Empress Hestra predates Tiber Septim by more than a millennium. Vaela should have already been dead. Not only was Tiber Septim there, so was Zurin Arctis and Izmir. Pelinel was there somehow. And of course, Mannimarco. What does Mannimarco say? As for myself, I was here and there and here again, like the rest of the mortals during the Dragonbreak. How do you think I learned my mystery? The Marukati Selective showed us all the glories of the dawn so that we might learn simply, as above, so below. In real life, as above, so below begets the other adage, as below, so above. That is the mechanism by which the Marukati tried to select. That is the logical follow-up of Mannimarco learning this truth and seeing it all happen. The Middle Dawn is called the Middle Dawn for a reason, and it's not the mundane reason that it was like the dawn, it's because it was the dawn, but in the middle. Mannimarco says so. The Selective showed the glories of the dawn, and it was there that Mannimarco learned his mystery. Mannimarco ascended to godhood during the Dragonbreak, and Mannimarco saw it happen. He learned his mystery then, but more importantly, there was always a Necromancer's moon because of this. Check out Worm Saga, Mannimarco's autobiography, and read it with all this in mind. He wasn't lying. He was an Aldmer, the future king of worms, directly descended from the god of worms. Not biologically, but metaphysically. He was always destined, long before birth, to exceed all mortals. Necromancy chose him. His mystery isn't just necromancy as an art, it's the mystery of himself. It's his mystery. If you want to know the more mundane aspects of Mannimarco's life, I'll direct you to a Dareloth video on the subject. I won't be going over the simple stuff. So, Mannimarco was one of the many people in the game Daggerfall who was trying to get his hands on the Totem of Tiber Septim. He wanted this because he actually wanted the Mantilla, the Crux of Transcendence. What does Crux of Transcendence even mean? Here's a silly Ted Peterson poem, written when asked about if the word Mantilla had anything to do with the word mantle. You're quite a clever fellow, you never bluster nor bellow. Fortune's flux hangs in a crux of mantling a mantilla. He hides the reference right there. Here it is more explicit, from a Kirkbride forum post. Give me a little example of how a mythopaic enchantment might work on, say, chorus-based changes to the Hanged Man by Kagernak, age 8. The Hanged Man, if you don't know your tarot, symbolizes negative stasis and a need for change via a new perspective. The image is usually a figure hung and bound, sometimes upside down. He has no choice but to struggle fruitlessly or accept his suffering and learn from it, at which point he can transcend his position. Sometimes the figure is Jesus on the cross, or Odin on Yggdrasil, or Judas on the tree. There is thus also a connection to sacrifice. So how about we somewhat bring this back down to Nirn? The Mantilla is a crux of transcendence. A crux is a cross, but that could also mean crossroads, an intersection which could go multiple ways. Honestly, I've already explained all the details needed to answer several questions here, so I'll just lay out the answers. Mannimarco the Mortal used the Crux of Transcendence as his phylactery to become a Lich. A Lich is just somebody who animates their body with their own soul, separated from their body. For normal people, this kills them. But for Mannimarco, he became a god because that's what the Crux of Transcendence is for. It's in the name. The Crux of Transcendence itself is the heart of the Underking, which means it's the heart of Talos. Remember that the Lich moves his soul into a phylactery in order to modify it. To do so with the Crux of Transcendence allowed him to ascend to godhood, and this happened during the Warp in the West, the same time as the Dawn. Mannimarco the god's soul was altered at the same time as the Dawn time, and when all was said and done, his soul was divine ever since that dawn, and Mannimarco the Lich remained, his divine soul always animating his leftover body. That's the simple version, and here's the complicated version. This is where it gets fun. Mannimarco is not the only mortal to have become a god. Two obvious examples are Arche and Talos. Let's stick with Talos. This isn't a Talos video, so I'll keep it brief. I assume everybody knows most of this anyway, and I don't have any novel information about Talos outside of what he has to do with Mannimarco. So, everybody knows Talos was multiple people. That's what makes him the many-headed Talos. Tiber Septim and Zurant Arctis are the two most well-known members of the Talos Oversoul, explicitly stated in Skeleton Man's interview with Denizens of Tamriel by Zal the Marukati. Less agreed upon, but obviously the case, is Izmir Wolfhearth. Now Tiber Septim, he himself was multiple people. Hjalti Earlybeard, Talos Stormcrown, and an orc, according to Michael Kirkbride. Plus, you had to have been related to Tiber Septim to use the totem of Tiber Septim, which makes some things easier. The way that all these people became Talos was by mantling Lorkhan, the missing god. This is stated directly by Nuhata and Nuhata of the Sphinxmoth Inquiry Tree. Tiber Septim, the storm crown mantled by way of the fourth, the steps of the dead. Mantling and incarnation are separate roads. Do not mistake this. The latter is built from cobbles of drawn bone destiny. The former, walk like them until they must walk like you. He mentions the fourth, and there he's talking about the fourth of the 6 walking ways. The walking ways themselves are ways to achieve divinity. They're all listed in Love Letter from the 5th era. Nuhata calls the 4th way the Steps of the Dead, which is the same as mantling. I've talked about mantling before, so real quick. It's acting so much like somebody that you tricked all of reality into thinking you're that person. This is why it's the Steps of the Dead. You are following somebody else's footsteps. Tiber Septim's conquest so mirrored Lorkhan's path, he slotted into Lorkhan's place. He did this instead of becoming Lorkhan or joining his aspect, because Lorkhan is the missing god. His place among the divines was vacant, and because Tiber Septim didn't do it alone, a whole bunch of people were swept up into the legend of Tiber Septim. Think how in real life we have figures like King Arthur, Homer, or much more recently, Ned Ludd. Probably they existed, but also, probably they existed as multiple figures conglomerated into a singular semi-mythical figure. Tiber Septim is like that, except in the Elder Scrolls, myth and history are the same thing, which is reality. So how does this relate to Mannimarco? Nuhata tells us about Mannimarco too. King of Worms, the gills of Akatosh have mended this new edition. Mannimarco remains as he was, the High Priest of Maggots. As dismissive as this likely human Moth Priest is, he does tell us that Mannimarco was a Numedition. The Numidium is a tower, and this is not a video about tower lore. But it's important to note that the Stone of Numidium was always meant to be a mantilla, not the heart of Lorkhan. In this way, not only is the mantilla the crux of transcendence, it's the stone of a tower of world refusal. Mannimarco thus manipulated his own soul through the mantilla by removing all mortality, creating a divine soul, and activation of the Numidium always results in Dragonbreaks. So by Numedition, I think what's meant is that Mannimarco was added to the pantheon of gods at a period of untime created by the Numidium. Albeit, Mannimarco is a lesser god, enemy to Arche, specifically when he clearly wants to take Arche's place. Which means it's time to talk about Arche. Really, this could get complicated, but I'm going to try to keep it simple. Let's just notice that Arche is the god of the cycle of birth and death, and also the Lord of Seasons. He's associated with all cycles, and in that way, he has a temporal aspect to him. Seasons are a kind of cyclical time. In adding himself as enemy of Arche, in some way, you could see Mannimarco as putting himself in opposition to a time god. However, Arche has no divine double like Akatosh does, so in a different way, the place was vacant just as with Talos. And speaking of Talos, there's a fun little line in Daggerfall, which random NPCs will say, after you've accepted the quest, the Ancient Watcher. The King of Worms and the Underking are supposed to be one and the same. And that's another one off the list of things to talk about. Talos is the amalgam of those who followed in the footsteps of Lorkhan. The Underking is one of those people, in fact, one of the least contentious members of the Talos Oversoul. Mannimarco was equated to the Underking. Therefore, Mannimarco was an aspect of Talos. Bam, that's called modus ponens. Bet you didn't see that coming. This also fits with what I said about Arche as a time god. It's always been my little pet theory that Arche is part of the Akatusk, which I will not explain now. The point is, Mannimarco inserted himself as a missing Lorcanic opposition to the Akatoshian Arche. And for my last trick, I'll explain why Mannimarco still existed in Oblivion as a pancake-faced Myrrh. As New Hata states, the Jills mended the story of Mannimarco. They did a poor job of it really, and the underlying fact of the matter didn't change. The Necromancer's moon is Mannimarco's divine soul, and a body was left behind, animated by said soul. Mannimarco was born, he lived and then he died, or at least his body did. But his soul was always divine. The Jills couldn't get rid of the Revenant, merely include the mortal. But Mannimarco isn't the only example of this mortal/god distinction. If you ever read The Trial of Vivec, Vivec's entire argument to his innocence of his murder of Nerevar is that Vivec the mortal killed Nerevar, but Vivec the god didn't. Hear him in his own words. But when Vec the mortal reached into the heart, he ceased to be anything except for what he wished to be. The axis erupted. There was an exact cracking, an instant of pure Arbus, and Vivec the god who had never been had always been. A whole universe swelled up to legitimize his throne, as the old universe, where Vec the mortal still lapped up God's blood, warped itself to accept its new equivalent. And like all things magical, it simply could not happen, could not be. Red Mountain was the intersection of the is not, as it was of old, its center point, and it did not hold. And so the dragon, having broken, saw fit to heal, turning into the world you know. Except now Vivec the god was alive before his own birth, which had, in fact, really happened in the death of the last universe. Mannimarco was present at the trial, by the way. The trial was a forum roleplay done 2 years before Oblivion came out. The role of Mannimarco was played by Gary Noonan, who I'm happy to find out still works at Bethesda. So there is a lore through line left at that company after all. Anyway, this isn't a Vivec video, but I, quite frankly, don't think Vivec became a god through the heart of Lorcan. While I don't deny his godhood, I don't think the heart of Lorcan can do that directly. And I don't think Sotha Sil or Almalexia were gods at all. All proper Thalmor would note that gods do not die. Vivec is also a liar, and a murderer, and a rapist, so not really somebody you should trust about the nature and origin of his own godhood. I got a comment on my Hist video questioning why I didn't like the Hist, because the video title implied it. I said it, but I didn't come out and say why explicitly. So let me use this time to come out and say why I think Necromancy is good and cool, actually. As a Myrrh enthusiast, I note that the problem with mortality on Nirn is that Myrrh were previously divine. The study of the soul, then, seems instrumental to understanding how to return to that divinity. If you check out the text The Road to Sovngarde, the author says that Shor created Sovngarde in Aetherius, and that many people have tried to part the veil of his deceit. His deceit is mortality. You can't out-trick the trickster, says this idiot Nord. Well, Mannimarco did. A human apologist might note that the entire point of Nirn, from a human perspective, is to transcend mortality. You as a viewer might note that I just said Mannimarco mantled a Lorcanic aspect. In a way, you could say Mannimarco just won Lorcan's trial. But even a hypothetical Mannimarco who never became a divine, undying lich would have been divine anyway had not the Mundus been created. Necromancy provided a path for Mannimarco to shed his mortality. Others could do it too, if they weren't all so inept and short-sighted. Even Mannimarco complained that so many other necromancers, even his followers, were incompetent. That incompetence gives Necromancy a bad reputation. While creating zombie minions might be useful, it's not the point. Becoming a lich has great potential, but incredible drawbacks to everyone too stupid to understand Lorcan's tricks. Failure leads to insanity at best, and that insanity makes it really common for necromancers to be evil. There's also the sanctity problem. Most Myrrh correctly note the divine lineage of their golden souls, so to tamper with that is seen as corrupting your connection to the divine. But that's just if you don't know what you're doing. Mannimarco showed us the way. There's also the ideal masters, but forgive me for not wanting to settle for Patamaic divinity in Oblivion. I didn't forget they exist, they're just a less impressive example than Mannimarco. Plus, there's all kinds of other uses. Talking with departed loved ones, getting a second chance at an afterlife, protecting sacred sites, All of this is undeniably good and cool. Even the more malign stuff like creating undead armies can be done with vestiges instead of mortal Anuic souls. And if you're squeamish about corpses, you can even get into flesh magic, bypassing the previously living entirely. Anything is possible with necromancy. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe for more videos eventually.